up, everybody? All right, looks like we all set up here. How's everybody doing on this Hump Day Wednesday? Hope you guys having a great week. Hope you guys having a great week. Lots of things happening around the world, around the country, around our state, on our little island here on Kauai. Um, Hello, everybody. It's Mel Raposo. Charlie is working late tonight, so he may or may not come on. I don't think so. Based on what he was telling me that he had to do, he's going to be tied up for a while. So that's all right. You got me solo, and we got Dr. Tim Brown coming on in a few minutes to share with us. Of course, the new numbers came out. No surprise. I feel like this is deja vu. I really do. I think I could probably take a show from last year uh, and play it tonight, and everyone would think it was live because nothing has really changed. What's up, Pops? Thank you for jumping on. Thank you, everybody, for jumping on. Tonight gonna be a great show. Dr. Tim Brown from the East West Center always is very informative. Very he shoots from the hip. He don't sugarcoat anything, and that's kind of what we try to do here. Uh, you know, I know there's a lot of people. Every day that goes by, there's a lot of people that uh, are less pressured about COVID. They just think COVID is really like the flu or a cold, and it is what it is. We got to respect everybody for their beliefs, and I don't blame them. I guess I'm tired of COVID too. I am, but I don't know. Take a look around, people. Take a look around. If you know someone personally that has COVID right now, put an emoji on the. I don't care any kind of emoji. Put a shaka or put a sad face. If you know someone personally right now, or let's say within the last month, that has or had COVID, not a friend that told you that they're no, somebody that you know personally that has or had COVID within the last month, go ahead and put an emoji in the comments because um, I know a lot of people that have COVID right now, and some of them are really sick. Uh, some of them are uh, didn't get hit that hard, and uh, I guess my point is every day that goes by, they they they're not looking at the numbers, and the way the state has uh, the way the state messages this, the way the state puts out their weekly testing. And I watched the news tonight, and Joe Moore, who I think is a great newscaster, has come up, and he's getting the information from the State Department of Health, and they call out the number, oh, 8 more since last week, like it's a small number, but they're not looking at the big number. The big number is huge. We have a lot of virus. Look at the hey, thanks for all the emojis, and I'm sorry for your friends or your family that is gotten COVID. But I think when you look at the big picture and understanding the positivity rates, Kauai is still going up. 10 weeks in a row, people. 2.5 months. 10 weeks in a row, the numbers continue to rise, and we know that's just a fraction of what is really out there. I mean, no one's going to dispute that. But yet there is an attempt by the state to continue to minimize. I mean, they speak with forked tongue, right? Because they really stress the fact that you got to be wearing masks, right? They don't want to implement any type of safety measures. Governor said that on his spotlight this week. He's just not even considering it right now. No one is, right? Everyone's afraid of the backlash from the communities and the businesses. But uh, I think we've said on this show numerous times, the indoor mask mandate would not impact businesses. My God, it'd be a little inconvenient for some, not many. I mean, it's a habit, right? It's a habit for most of us. But those they want to continue to say that we're taking away a freedom because we're asking them to wear a mask. Like, really, uh, do we take away your freedoms because we require you to wear a seatbelt? No, I don't see protesters about seatbelts. I I don't like wearing a seatbelt I think I told you the story before. I was a police officer when the law passed. I didn't wear it until my sergeant or my lieutenant, somebody noticed that I wasn't wearing my seatbelt and told me, you know, if I ever catch you not wearing a seatbelt, you're going to be suspended. So I started wearing a seatbelt, and after a while, it's just a habit, you know. It's an automatic thing. The mask, yeah, it's a little inconvenient, but for me, it's not. It doesn't bother me anymore. In fact, I wear them. It's not a problem. And if I'm outdoors, I take it off. If I'm around people, I put it on. It's that simple. If I go indoors, I always wear a mask indoors. So I mean, it doesn't inconvenience me at all. But I'm different. But the governor is not considering. No one is, right? None of the mayors are. It's just that these numbers are astronomical, and I think the general consensus or the general belief by many people is that COVID is not serious. It's just, you know, you're not going to die. You're not going to go to the hospital. You might get sick for a few days. You might be really sick, but you'll get over it. And it's worth it because now we can do what we want. And I blame the state for that. You know, I blame the state. You know, I don't know how many of you saw Josh Green's commercial, his recent commercial, his governor campaign commercial. He says straight from his mouth. He says, "I'm proud how we performed," or he said, I forget. I'm going to paraphrase. He basically said, "I'm proud of the way we came through COVID, but now we must look forward." In well, he's right about moving forward. We do have to move forward, but we have not come out of COVID. We have not come out of this pandemic. How can you say that? We got 10 weeks came through. Thanks, George. I'm proud of the way we came through COVID. But now, we gotta go. We gotta look forward to other things. Like he has conceded, he has acknowledged that the pandemic is over. See, those types of messaging coming from our lieutenant governor, who happens to be a doctor, impacts people. It The message is that we're done with COVID, and now we got to start looking at affordable housing. He's gonna build 10,000 homes or whatever he's gonna do. But he's acknowledged the fact that we have come through COVID, and now it's time to move on. I think that's dangerous. I think it's irresponsible, especially coming from a doctor. I'll ask Dr. Tim Brown tonight, who's well respected in the community, the medical community, and in fact the community at large. Uh, I don't know how you can say that. I don't know how anyone can say that I'm proud of the way we came through this pandemic and now it's time to move on when we are week 10 of rising numbers. But anyway, I am so happy tonight that we have Dr. Tim Brown on, as always. Um, you know, welcome, Dr. Brown.
Hey, Mel. Good to see you.
Same here, man. Dr. Brown, East West Center. This guy's is an amazing, amazing guy. We're going to hear from him about today's numbers. I was just telling the village, Doc, that it's like deja vu. It's like I'm almost getting tired of repeating myself, but I cannot say I'm surprised by the numbers. In fact, I think you and many other experts in the field have has predicted that this will continue for quite a while. And but the numbers come out once a week, which I think is a mistake. I think it should be every day, like it used to be, to keep the awareness level up. But the numbers come out, it just comes out, and no one really says anything. I think the governor at Spotlight said, he has no plans on changing anything or implementing anything, any safety measures at this time. Uh, how is 8,924 cases last week and 8,124 rising? It's 800 less. Well, I think when you look at the case numbers, you look at the hospitalizations went up, deaths went up, and I think you also got to take into account that there are numerous cases that aren't counted. So I don't know how they figure out their 7-day average, because when I do the math, it comes out a little different. It's a lot higher daily average. I still got to try to figure it out. Maybe you can answer that question. But anyway, Doc, thank you for joining us tonight. Um, what are your thoughts, man? You saw the numbers today. I don't think you're surprised, but
Well, on that 7-day average, it's basically because it's a 7-day average for about a week ago. the way they actually calculate it. They don't include the last 3 days, and they do a 7-day average centered around basically about a week from the day they report that number. So that's why it doesn't quite do the math the way most people normally would do it. I think the other thing to remember about this week's numbers is that there was Memorial Day in there, and the number of tests was down in the last 3 or 4 days. So that's going to be affecting the total case numbers as well, and that weekly number. And that will come up over the next several days, probably, as they bring in more of the reports and more of the catch-up testing that's coming from Memorial Day. I mean, my basic take on the numbers is it looks like there's probably some slowing. I mean, Maui seems to be seeing that the positivity rate turn over a bit. You might read that on Kauai, although the numbers are a bit jumpy there, so it's hard to say that for sure. Oahu seems to be more or less stable. So I think that we may be getting close to the peak of this particular surge. But again, given the influence of the Memorial Day numbers, I think we need to wait until next week to be able to say that with any sort of confidence. But with that said, we're still at extremely high numbers right now. Remembering that a large number of the cases aren't getting reported because of home testing, or people just not testing at all. They get sick, they don't bother to test at this point because many of them are just assuming that it's a relatively innocuous virus, which of course it isn't, which is why people are still in the hospital. Number of hospitalizations continues to climb. I forget exactly what the numbers were for Haima today, but the HHS numbers were about 212. So that number continues to increase over time.
I know George is on, and I think it was, I saw some posts. I believe it was 226. It's kind of interesting because the state numbers that came out was like at 189. So it's hard. The other question, I look at COVID Act now, the national website. They get daily numbers from Hawaii, and I'm not sure how they get the numbers every single day. They have all the numbers, and we don't. So I'm assuming that the state does prepare these numbers every day, but for some reason there's someone's collecting it on the mainland or sharing it with the mainland, but not sharing it with the public.
Well, I think this hospital reporting has always been a problem right from day one. I mean, part of the problem is we don't really have a very solid national system for this sort of thing, and the state system has always been rather haphazard. I think it's basically what the hospital association prepares and then shares with people. And I think that's part of the reason why we get different numbers. The HHS reporting bounces around because some days they have 24 hospitals, some days they have 26 hospitals reporting, so there's fluctuations there. The Haima numbers, I'm not sure what their actual source is. But again, I think as long as we've had hospital numbers, we've basically had 2 or 3 separate counts. When Josh Green was doing the hospital numbers, he gave us a different set of numbers than basically what HHS was getting and what Haima was producing. So, I think just treat the hospital numbers as kind of ballpark numbers. They're definitely not overly accurate, but with that said, they are definitely showing still an increasing trend. And we did pass 200 on the HHS scale today. So,
yeah, well, we know that the hospitalizations are rising. We know that the people on ventilators are rising. We know that the numbers of deaths are rising, and this is happening every week now for 10 weeks. But there seems to be no concern. I remember when the hospitalizations were at 8 and 12 and 14, and they said, well, once we get to, we're not near where we were at 400 back in whenever summer of last year, and they're using that as the comparison. But if you think about it, that is a lot of people right now in the hospital with COVID. That's a significant number. And what's happening is, and I shared with my story when I was at Queens. I was supposed to be in the hospital for 2 or 3 days, but I was, after one night, they they put me out because they needed the bed,
Right.
and not because of COVID per se, but the numbers of hospitalizations generally is rising, and when you have this type of increases with COVID, it's going to put some pressure on the healthcare system in general. And I don't know at what number or at what point do we start getting concerned again and making sure that we try to do everything we possibly can to slow the surge. That's what I I, I battle with every day.
I mean, what concerns me is I think that at this point I've kind of given up on trying to convince politicians, and that applies at the national level every bit as much as it applies at the local level, to try to do the right thing and to do things such as putting masking mandates back in place or taking steps really to discourage the spread of this virus in the community. I think we're not seeing that. And part of what I'm concerned about is the still, relative invisibility of these numbers to most people, because that doesn't tell them that there is such an active level of community spread right now that they really should be taking additional precautions. And, if the leaders would at least come out, the governor, at least on his spotlight appearance, did say that, yes, he encouraged people to mask and so on. But encouraging, doesn't get us to the level of masking we really need to interrupt the type of transmission that we're seeing right now. And it's a real concern because, even if we are reaching a point where we're starting to level off a bit, remember, it's probably going to take just as long to go down as it came up, which means we'll be talking another 10 weeks before we get down to a low level. And that's assuming that BA4 and BA5, which are now in the state, don't change the dynamics. And that's something we really have to worry about. We don't have a whole lot of experience with BA4 and BA5 at the national level globally. The two countries that have seen it so far at substantial levels are South Africa and Portugal. In South Africa, they got a fifth wave basically associated with BA4, BA5. Fortunately, it did not seem to produce a substantial number of hospitalizations or deaths, but it's important to remember that in a very recent seroprevalence survey that was done in South Africa, 98% of the people there had antibodies to spike protein, and about 88, almost 90% had antibodies to nuclear capsid, which means they had actually been infected in the past with one of the COVID variants. So you're talking about a population that has an extremely high infection rate at this point. So we don't know how that's going to translate into our country where only about 65% are vaxxed. We're not quite sure what the actual percentage of those who've been infected in the past is. And so I think there are a lot of open questions there. In Portugal, they had a big BA1, BA2 wave over basically over January to March, almost exactly the same that we did. And then they went into a trough, but now they're coming back up again with a BA5 wave coming. And that one seems to be more associated with death than the BA1, BA2 wave was. They're seeing their deaths coming up rather quickly right now, which is a little concerning because if BA5 does produce more severe illness or increase the mortality rates, we could see that coming here sometime in the not too distant future. Because we know that it's here, but the way these things spread, slowly at first, it may be another 7 or 8 weeks before we get to a substantial enough level of BA4, BA5 that it starts to produce increased mortality if we follow the Portugal pattern at this point. Now, we don't know what we're going to follow. Will we follow the South Africa pattern with relatively low hospitalizations of death, or will we follow the Portugal pattern where they're starting to see more deaths now? That we just don't know at this point. And as I've said many, many times before, anybody who predicts the future of the COVID epidemic is basically selling you a fairy tale. Nobody can predict this thing. Nobody has, even CDC doesn't even attempt to do their 1 month predictions anymore. They just gave up on that for cases. They'll still do it for hospitalizations and deaths because those are determined by the infections that have happened to date. but they don't do it for cases anymore because nobody can really predict this very well. So I think, it is a real concern, and we do know BA4 and BA5 are here. So far, they've detected 2 infections that we know of, but we don't know how rapidly they're going to replicate here. In the United Kingdom right now, they're about BA4 and BA5 both are about 5% of all the sequence cases, and they are growing. But again, that early phase of growth takes a long time, but then it accelerates just like, it's typical exponential growth. So again, it may be several weeks before we start to see the impact of BA4 and BA5 on our hospitalizations and deaths. And so we just have to wait and see how that's going to play out.
For those of you that don't know, Dr. Tim Brown with the East West Center has been tracking COVID and the variants from the beginning over 2 years ago. And he's done a great job with, I don't want to say predicting, but basically sharing his insights that have pretty much been spot on. Doc, throughout this pandemic, has the trend been consistent when we see a new variant of concern, such as BA1, BA2, BA4, BA5? When it pops up in South Africa, has the trends been consistent as it relates to the time it takes before we see it here and here in Hawaii? Is that pretty much consistent with the growth of the variant or the spread of the variant in those other countries?
Not really. I think, the spread of the variants from country to country is quite variable. Omicron, we saw spread very rapidly across the world. That was so much more infectious than the previous variants, that wasn't surprising. Alpha, we actually didn't get too much of an alpha wave here in Hawaii, although in Europe, that was huge. That was the one that occurred December 2020, early 2021. That was a huge wave in Europe. Alpha basically started, as far as we can tell, started in the UK and then pretty much spread across Europe very quickly. So I think that, that's not not surprising at all. But in the United States, for example, we saw very different patterns with alpha. We saw actually pretty severe alpha epidemics, for example, up in the north, Wisconsin, Minnesota, I believe, saw pretty severe epidemics. But in the south, we didn't see much alpha at all. And so I think it's, it just depends on the part of the country. It depends on what just happens to get into that particular region of the country. Here, of course, we get exposed to everything because of the high number of tourists coming in right now. So, it's to be expected that variants are going to get in here pretty quickly. I find, one of the interesting things is that we here have been following more the pattern of the northeast of the country with the current wave of, BA 2.12.1, because that part of the country saw a very serious wave, whereas it hasn't really grown to the same extent in most of the rest of the country yet. And the open question right now is, are we, far enough into spring and getting towards summer in a lot of the country that we may not see a significant wave of BA 2.12.1 in some of those other parts, or will people going indoors for air conditioning because of the heat then basically produce those waves? That's actually what we saw with Delta. We actually saw, kind of a wave in the north followed by a wave in the south as we got towards summer, and basically people started moving indoors. So, there's a lot of variability in these things in different parts of the country, in different countries themselves. And here in Hawaii, we kind of have our own unique patterns, I think, as things have played out.
Well, a big contributor obviously is travel. And I've been reading one of the most dangerous places, and I think you've brought this up as many others have, that one of the most dangerous places or vulnerable places to be is at airports. And over the Memorial Day weekend, thousands and thousands and thousands of flights have been canceled with all these passengers stranded at airports, most of them not wearing masks and congregating and hanging out, waiting for a next available flight, and eventually getting on a plane and getting to their destination. Do you see that as being a potential super spreader event? These airports that are, again, even at the Hui Airport, I drove past today. It's amazing how many people are not wearing masks. A very small percentage of people are wearing masks at the airport. And granted, as I drive past, it's outdoors, but when I had to fly to Oahu, uh, inside the terminal, it's the same thing. It's no one's wearing masks anymore, and I'm wondering, is that going to contribute to the spread of these new variants across the country because of the Memorial Day weekend flight problems?
Well, I think, that's certainly going to contribute. Anytime you get a large group of people together not wearing masks with these extremely contagious variants, you've got substantial possibility for transmission. We know that, even in lunchrooms and things, we're seeing transmission. I mean, I think a lot of us have noted in our personal context that the number of people getting infected in the last month or so has definitely been going up. I mean, I run in a circle that, pretty much had avoided COVID until very, very recently. I mean, most of the people I interact with on a regular basis pretty much got through the first 2 years without COVID. Now, several of them are coming down with it. Some of it is clearly travel related. I think, travel and when you're in a space like an airport for an extended period of time with large groups of people, somebody in there is almost certainly infected. They are going to be breathing out virus. If you're close to them, you may be breathing in directly from them. If there's not good ventilation in the place, then it will accumulate over time. And the longer you're in there, the greater your chance you will get infected. So certainly that's the case. The other problem I think you've got with travel is airplanes themselves. Well, we get fed this constant claim that airplanes are safe. The reality is the boarding process is anything but safe. People have repeatedly monitored the CO2 levels during the boarding process when the HEPA filtration system is not turned on the planes. They're typically running from a unit that's just connected to the plane from the ground. And that has very poor ventilation, very poor throughput. And basically CO2 levels rise to 2,000, 3,000 compared to the, baseline 400 outdoors and 600 in say a normal office environment. So that boarding and unboarding process is extremely risky. And with nobody wearing masks anymore, you're all up there scrambling to get your stuff out of the overhead bins. You're in each other's faces, breathing in each other's faces. Chances are very high during that process you may transmit. Furthermore, despite the claims of the airline industry, while you are flying, even though there are HEPA filters in place, there's a lot of documented cases before these more infectious variants. You go back to kind of the pre-masking or even the early masking on airlines, and basically there was a significant amount of transmission on aircraft. And normally at that time it would typically be within 2 to 3 seats, before or after of the index case. But with these more infectious variants, I would not be surprised to see it spreading further. And also, people are getting up, going up and down the aisles. People are going into the bathrooms, coming out of the bathrooms. Bathrooms themselves don't have the greatest ventilation in the world. So no, I consider flying actually to be high risk if you're not wearing a very high quality mask the entire time. And even if you are, you need to be careful. Don't take it off, for drinking, for eating, and so on while you're on the plane. Do your drinking and eating before you get on the plane. Because if you do take it off on the plane, there is risk associated with that. So I think you do have to be much more careful these days.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot more infection these days. So from when those studies were done, because there were so many safety protocols, the testing and or vaccine cards or whatever, there were less infected people boarding those planes than today. I mean, there is absolutely zero safety protocols now for travel. So we have to assume that in that 220 seat plane, there's more people carrying the virus than there were back when we had the safety protocols in place. So you call them the index cases. I think there's with the way we travel today, there's many more index cases throughout that aluminum tube that can create many more transmissions than we used to. And the fact that no one's wearing a mask anymore on the plane including the crew. I was shocked to
Well,
see.
I mean, there's a reason why the airlines have canceled thousands of flights over the Memorial Day holiday. They don't have the crew to staff those flights because everybody's out sick. I mean,
Yep.
this is the whole problem. I mean, the airlines were the ones who pushed for removing the mask mandate on aircraft. And then once they got that, the first thing that happened was like within a week, I think Delta had canceled 100 flights because they didn't have the crew to staff them. Uh, Cause and effect is pretty clear here, right? You lift the mask
Yep.
mandate, and all of a sudden, lots of people get infected, lots of people get sick, and all of a sudden, you're missing your cabin crews. Not shocking.
Yeah, and I think the airline industry would be a little more concerned, or a little more. Um, they would change their behavior if they had to compensate every passenger that didn't make their flight that they purchased. Like if you miss your flight and you want to rebook, you got to pay. If there's all these regulations that, or these entitlements for airlines to charge the passenger, but they could cancel 1,000 flights and not have to compensate anyone for all the disrupted schedules, flight travel plans. Tough, tough. Screw you. So the airlines really, yeah, they have lost revenue, but they don't have any punitive. They don't have to pay. I think they should have to pay passengers that get disrupted because of uh, a problem, whether it's staffing. I don't care what it is. I mean, if it's an act of God, that's a different story. But this isn't an act of God because it's because of what they pushed for at Congress. This is what they requested. They went out and played hardball and got them to lift the testing and vaccination requirements and now the masking requirements. It's crazy. And a lot of people's. Go ahead.
Frankly, I wish we flew under the European rules. The European rules are actually much more passenger friendly. If
Yeah.
European airlines basically start screwing around with you, basically they get docked with very heavy penalties. And they have to pay you compensation. They have to provide you an overnight hotel, which U.S. airlines virtually never do anymore. I've actually had to push and use that. If you board in the EU and they then bump you on a flight or you don't make a connection or something of the sort, then they are required under EU rules to provide you an overnight. And I actually had to fight with one of the front counter staff at one of the airlines, I won't mention which one, to tell them, no, sorry, under EU rules, you have to provide me a hotel room tonight. You do not have an option on that. Was, under US rules, anything goes. They basically can do whatever they want with you. They can charge you all sorts of penalties and fees, even when they screw up. And,
Mhm.
our entire airline industry has never been passenger friendly.
Yeah. The other thing, and our mayor. One thing I like about our mayor, he does a daily report and he does share. And it was last week's report. I believe it was last week's report. He talks about the clusters that are being identified on our island, and he said there were several clusters. Uh, the first place was obviously schools. We had a pretty good outbreak here the last couple of weeks in schools. And the other problem, or the other source of clusters, were in businesses that employees. Now, this is not just one cluster. He specifically
Mm-hmm.
said several clusters at several businesses here on Kauai, because employees went to work sick, never wore a mask, never had personal hygiene, and never observed the social distancing rules. So this is another problem. But uh, I don't hear that coming from our state. I don't hear the warnings. I hear it on Kauai, but the mayor's show is on Facebook. Uh, how many people watch it? We need this statewide broadcasting system where everyone is aware of what's going on, so we can, number one, know the true danger of this virus, and number two, do what we need to do to stop or slow down the spread. And that's what's absent right now. It is amazing when you watch the news now. Remember when COVID used to be the numbers would be the first story of the day, and now it's four or five on the list, and people aren't getting the proper information, and I think that's causing a lot of problems as it relates to the spread.
What I think we need, I think what we need is we need a relatively simple, easily understandable source where people can get this. I mean, there should be something like a COVID weather report that's updated daily, that is readily available, for example, on the newspapers or on the websites of the media outlets, where you could just go there, you click on this, it brings up one page that shows you what the COVID trend looks like, what the hospitalization trend looks like, and what the positivity rate is. And then at the bottom, it shows you, we're in the red on transmission, we're a high transmission area. And not using these idiotic new community levels that CDC came up with that basically downplay and turn the whole map green. Use the old CDC community transmission graph, which is entirely red across the country. There's kind of a few little blue spots left in the middle of the country, but I was comparing last week's map with this week's maps, and those blue spots are starting to disappear pretty quick. So, just a simple thing, you could get it on the Star Advertiser site. You should be able to click and get to the same page from any of KITV or KHON, whoever, and just make it readily accessible to people, easy for people to get to. Just like you can get the weather report by clicking on a weather link. Should be exactly the same thing. That way, if people want that information, it's easily accessible. You don't have to remember, where is it on the Department of Health website, and then wade through 10 or 15 different graphs that most people don't care about any of that. They only want to get like, what's the current trend? Make it simple so that people can actually understand it, and then provide them actionable information down below, where you can get a test, where you can get access to a high quality mask, preferably for free. We should be handing out N95s like candy. They should be readily accessible to anybody who wants them in the islands. Where you can get access to treatment. Okay, test and treat sites. That's what we need. And right now, to navigate our system is just, it's too difficult for most people. To number one, a lot of us don't even know who our physician is, our appointed care provider and so on. Then we have to get in touch with them. We have to get a test. Whether they require us to take a test with them or whether they'll act off a rapid test is not clear in most cases. You have to get a test from them. You're probably going to wait at least 24 hours to get the results back. Then you have to get the doctor to give you a prescription. Then you have to get access to the treatment. All of this is supposed to happen within the first 5 days, within 5 days of your first symptom or your first positive test, if you're going to access Paxlovid or one of the other treatments. Our system is not set up for speed. In fact, it's such a bureaucratic and such a difficult system to navigate. Sure, somebody like me, who's basically used to pushing on them and making them do what I want them to do, because I've learned that's the only way to get our healthcare providers basically to give us adequate service, is you really have to push them. So I can push on them. I know how to navigate that system. The average person does not. And so their chances of getting Paxlovid within 5 days, not necessarily the greatest. And I think that's a real issue here. And we haven't really set up test and treat sites where you can get your test, get a physician to examine you on the site, look at your record, and then prescribe the drugs, and then you have the drugs and you take them home with you. That's what really should be set up here.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was you or one of the other doctors on the show that said every medicine cabinet should have Paxlovid in the medicine cabinet just in case you test positive, because you're right, they're not accepting a home test, although that's what they're providing us for free. Um, and then the whole issue of getting a PCR, and then
I think you have to be careful, Mel. That varies. I contacted my primary care provider, and she said she would accept the result of a home test for prescribing it.
oh wow,
But I think
well,
you're
that's good
going
to
to
know.
find there's no standards on that. And so,
No,
my
there is no
recommendation, if you're worried about it, contact your primary care provider, make arrangements for what you will have to do to access those drugs quickly. Just do it in
and then
advance. That's what I
and
do.
then there's also the problem of, if you're young and healthy, some doctors won't prescribe you the Paxlovid, which is, to me, I think it's kind of crazy, but that's what's happening here on Kauai anyway. I know that for sure. I know a couple of friends who had and were sick, had symptoms, and you know, they were denied the treatment and just were told to go get the over-the-counter stuff. So you're right. Why isn't there a statewide standardized protocol for this? Unbelievable. I kind
Well,
of want
I
to go
mean, the
back.
White House talks about it and they're trying to push it. And they tell
Yeah,
you, oh, well, there's so many CVS sites, so many Walgreens sites you can go to and do test and treat. But there are actually comparatively few of those. They are typically booked days in advance. So it's simply not that easy to just walk in there. Not to mention, we actually don't want people who are sick walking into places like drugstores.
yeah.
We want them to basically get their test, get their access in a safe way so that we minimize the amount of risk to others in those locations. Walking to the back of your local CVS store basically to get your test and your drugs means that you've got people who are known sick in a public space, which is something we should be trying to avoid.
I don't know too many people that would want to take Paxlovid or anything for that matter, unless you need it, right? So I'm not sure why the pressure on the test. I mean, if you take a home test and you're positive, you call your doctor. I mean, why would you want to take Paxlovid if you're not COVID positive, right? I mean, I guess there's some people out there that might want to do that, but so I'm seeing in the comments that there are places that are using the home tests, and that is good. I just know two friends, one that's on this show right now, uh, was denied Paxlovid. So anyway,
That's the problem. There are no standards right now, and I
yeah,
mean, ideally the standards is, there are limitations on Paxlovid now just because the supply is more limited than, ideally we would love to give it to everybody, but the supply is limited at this point. So they do have certain criteria by which they give it. But again, those criteria should be clear to people.
hmm
So they should know whether they can get access to it.
yeah. I kind of want to go back to the CDC color chart because I, don't you find it upsetting that when we were in the green, right? That was the justification for loosening all safety measures, because CDC said we're in the green. And when the CDC finally throws us to red, all of a sudden we don't take the recommended action of the CDC, and not
Well,
at all.
I have to correct you on that, Mel. We are not in the red. We are in the pastel orange. Because you have to remember, the new CDC graph is done in beautiful pastel colors. A light green, a light orange, a very, very light red. Actually, it's more of a yellow and then a very light red that really, like I say, looks like a pastel orange. So it's a very soothing map. You look at it, even the places that are, like you say, red, are really not looking that bad. The problem is that map is nothing but propaganda to tell people that don't worry about it. What you really need to be looking at when you get to that page where that map is, go to the selection box, go down to the bottom. There is a map that says community transmission.
Mhm.
That's the map you want to look at because that's the map that's entirely red. That's
Yeah.
pretty much red across the country. And Hawaii has been red on that one for a long, long time. We were one
Well,
of the
we're
first
we're
places in the country to go red on that one.
we're top. We lead the nation right now.
We're
Uh,
number one. We're number one.
yes, we are number one, and so many politicians are patting themselves on the back because we were on the lower end of the scale throughout the pandemic, and right now we are at the very top. We are at the very top, and I don't see any. I mean, how can you even be proud of that? It's kind of embarrassing actually, because there are so many things that we could have done differently that would have not brought us to this point. And uh, it's frustrating. I mean, I heard that the feds are considering or talking about reinstituting masking on air flights and public transportation again. I mean, why is it taking so long when we know that the moment we lifted those mandates, cases rose? Oh, I don't understand why. And I understand the lobby, I understand the money people, all those corporate airline executives that have Biden's and everyone else's cell phone, and they can just call and say, hey man, you're hurting our company, we need to We need to loosen up. But every day that we go, every day that passes, today I saw over 280,000 cases in the nation. The highest has been since February. Since February, Doc. Um, that's because we don't have any safety protocols anymore for travel.
I think
And
I just pulled up the New York Times website, just to double check. Yeah, except for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, of the 50 states, we are still number one, and we're at 81 per 100,000 cases. And the next highest state is Rhode Island at 47 per 100,000 cases. So we're almost double what Rhode Island is. So yeah, we are by far the highest COVID cases in the country,
yeah,
bar none.
yeah,
And that's
we
with
won't.
all the underreporting that everybody's doing. So
Yeah, but I think it's all proportionate because everywhere is having the same uh, issues with the home testing that's not being counted. I don't know of any state that maybe maybe I don't know
no,
of anyone
everybody's suffering
that's
from the same problem.
yeah. So the underreporting, I don't know what that number. I've heard anywhere from 3 to 5. I think Dr. Altenberg says based on positivity rates, it could be 3 to 5 times higher. I hear other experts saying anywhere from 5 to 8 times higher. I don't know what that number is, and I don't think anyone does. But we know for a fact that the numbers that we see, it's 8,000 or whatever it is significantly higher. The real number is significantly higher. And I think that should be alarming. And I know that's kind of a disclaimer they sometimes say on the media, but it's not said in a way that people are hearing it. And I think that's why people have gotten really relaxed. Um, and again, just being COVID fatigue is at its highest right now. People are over it.
Well, I think it's not just COVID fatigue in the population. I think it's also COVID fatigue in the media. The media themselves are kind of over it. Uh, I mean, there are certain people in the New York Times, for example, Leonhardt, uh, who are pushing back against mask mandates, don't want to see masks, and even try to downplay sometimes the effectiveness of masks. And and I think some of that is, just I guess if you're in the fashionable circles in politics and so on, that group that attended the White House Correspondents' Dinner, then yeah, you kind of want to push back. You don't want to act like it's serious because then the people going to the White House Correspondents' Dinner were actually being kind of stupid, which they were, but we're not supposed to say that. And they're showing us how to live with COVID, which is if you're really rich and you basically have concierge doc services and so on, and you can get a test anytime you want one, and you're definitely going to get the drugs right away, then yeah, go ahead and get infected. Who cares? But that's not the way most of America lives, and most of America doesn't have access to that kind of health care that those 2,600 people in that crowded room had. And so, that to me was the height of stupidity. It was extremely bad taste. I think they did a real disservice to the American people in sending the wrong message about an ongoing pandemic where we are now seeing the consequences of that with people across the country getting infected at extremely high levels. I think nationwide we're probably getting close to where we were in January to March. We're probably in, a similar sort of level of infection at this point, and it's really concerning, at least in the parts of the country that have been affected heavily, like the Northeast and Hawaii itself. So yeah, I mean, why aren't we taking more precautions when we've got this much spread?
Dr. Altenberg was on last week, and he shared with us that we this surge is higher than the Delta surge was based on the numbers. I
Oh,
mean,
it's absolutely higher than the Delta surge just on the numbers that we've got, which are underreported. I think if you correct for the underreporting, we're probably higher than the December January surge. Is be my suspicion at this point, because I think the numbers are that badly underreported.
well, testing has dropped significantly. I see Oahu has restarted some of their testing sites. Kauai never stopped, but I passed a testing site almost every day, and I can remember when there were always activity. There were a lot of people that were concerned, like you said earlier. Right now, we got home tests, but even those that get a positive on the home test may want to go get a follow-up PCR. But there's very little activity now. Very little people are testing, and that's not going to change. I mean, that's going to continue. So going forward, we are going to see underreporting of cases, and they're going to, people look at that as this surge starts to peak and start to trend down. I don't know what the lag time is for uh, graduations and all of these different proms and then of course as we spoke earlier the BA4 BA5 we don't know what that's going to do yet. And for me, I would think that you would want to do whatever you can to stop the spread of these new variants before it starts, right? And that could be very simply by requiring the indoor mask mandates, or again, require testing to come into our state, or a vaccine card. That wasn't a federal guideline. That was a state's requirement. You come into our state, that's what you will do. But
Not
there's
coming
no,
back in an election year, I can pretty much guarantee you that.
exactly, and that's the thing. The timing was just horrific. When it was a non-election year, we had a lot of people standing up and yelling and fighting for the people. And now it's election year, so these guys are just silent. They're just, again, they're hiding. They're not standing up one way or the other. They're just going to play the safe road until election day.
Well, I hate to say it, but I mean, the thing that we all have to acknowledge is I think this is the state we're going to be in for the next at least couple of years, I would say. What we're seeing right now is probably what we're going to continue to see. We're going to see recurring waves of COVID. They may start to decrease in magnitude over time as immunity builds up in the population and people get, more and more protected from all their past exposures. But it's important to remember that two things are operative here. Number one, your protection from your vaccine or from your previous infection wanes over time. Okay, that's common to all the coronaviruses that, at least the common cold type coronaviruses. We see that over time, the immunity wanes. So after about 8 months, you probably don't have that much protection from your previous infection. And so you are at risk of getting reinfected again. Your vaccine also wanes over time. And with Delta and the previous variants, that waning was primarily in terms of protection against infection. But now we are seeing waning with these new variants, with the Omicron variants, in terms of also protection against hospitalization. So if you are one of those people who basically got your booster or got your second dose of vaccine back in June or July of last year, you better get in and get a booster, because your protection from that is way, way down. You're probably only about 60% protection against hospitalization with the new variants from an old shot like that. So you really ought to go in and get boosted. Again, if you're older, 50 or above, and you haven't had your fourth shot, go get your fourth shot now. There's such a high level of COVID in the community, you really want to avoid getting that infection if you can. And so I do think that, people aren't recognizing that this waning of immunity. I think the second thing that we've got to be concerned about going forward is that COVID itself is evolving around our protections. Okay. Once the population gets heavily immune, then the job one for COVID is to develop new changes that basically move around that immunity. And that is exactly what we're seeing with the Omicron variants right now. Omicron itself already moves substantially around immunity to the former wild type and also to Delta. But now the new Omicron variants are even moving around the immunity that was conferred by BA1 and BA2. So BA4 and BA5 are more effective at evading not only our vaccines, but also a previous infection with BA1 and BA2. So we're going to see this constant evolution of COVID to work around it. And our vaccines are going to have to be improved over time to keep up with that, which is why we are talking now about bivalent vaccines that will have at least a couple of variants in them in the fall. And hopefully I would hope in the future that we'll even move eventually to multivalent, where there's multiple variants that are in there. And hopefully that will give us better protection with those newer vaccines once they come. But with that said, those vaccines are still months away. So if you haven't been boosted yet, go get boosted now, please. For the sake of yourself and your family, get boosted now.
Real quick question from one of our viewers: what if you were fully vaccinated and had COVID in January of this year? Should you go get the fourth shot now? Yeah, so they had the two shots and the booster. Got COVID in January. Should they get a booster now?
Certainly, if they're in those older age groups, I would recommend that because you're far enough out. I mean, normally they recommend go ahead with the boosters anyway, even if you did get an infection. Just wait. Typically now they're only saying like wait 2 or 3 weeks. It used to be wait 3 months after your infection. Now they're saying go ahead and get boosted relatively soon after you recovered from your infection. And that person then is, if they were infected in January, they're 5 months out now. So they probably should get a booster at this point.
We've been talking about the BA, all of these variants of Omicron, right? The BA1, BA2, BA4, BA5. We had Alpha, we had the original strain, we had Delta, and with all these little variants in between. Um, do you expect to have, or is it possible or probable that we will see another new variant that's not a subvariant of Omicron, maybe a new one, whatever the next one is? Is that something that, why is Omicron, why does it have so many different subvariants? And seems like all the infection is coming from these subvariants and not another mutation or another new variant.
Well, right now, I mean, the major advantage that Omicron has is its high transmissibility. Okay, it spreads incredibly easy. I mean, some people would say it's actually getting up close to measles levels of transmissibility, which means if you're spending any extended period of time in a room with somebody with COVID and you're not masked, you're not protecting yourself, chances are pretty good you're probably going to contract it. So, I mean, they are that much more transmissible, and that's why they've come to dominate on a global scale. But what you are seeing within the Omicron family now is that evolution to work around the immunity that the population has developed. Okay, so what we're seeing, BA 2.12.1 in the US was kind of the first variant that developed more ability to evade our immunity, our existing immunity. Okay, and BA4, BA5 have also continued to do that. So they can evade even immunity from BA1 much better than they could in the past. You'll still have some immunity, but not the kind of protection you would have had against another BA1 infection. Okay? And that's, I think, going to be the name of the game as long as Omicron is dominant right now, is it will continue to develop new versions of itself that basically work around our immunities, both natural immunity from a previous infection and immunity from our vaccines. And that's why our vaccines need to do some catch up in the near future. But yes, the possibility of another variant coming out of left field is still there. The possibility of Omicron itself developing a variant that actually has more serious consequences in terms of mortality and severe illness is also there. We are seeing, I mean, there are some preliminary indications with BA4, BA5 that, at least in Syrian hamsters, they are actually more likely to infect lung tissue than the earlier Omicron variants were. Okay, so, that hasn't been observed in humans yet. But again, we've got to watch for that. We really don't understand BA4 and BA5 in terms of their impact on mortality at this point. Okay, and I think it's important to understand that they are still an unknown right now in terms of the level of severe illness they might cause. Because the only examples we have are Portugal, where the deaths are going up, and South Africa, where the wave wasn't that high, but where virtually everybody in the country has been infected at least once and probably 2 or 3 times. So I think that, we're dealing with very, very different. I noticed somebody says Syrian hamsters up there. Yeah. Unfortunately, the poor little critters are used quite often in COVID experiments, both actually to document airborne transmission, but also to look at, they infect them with COVID and then they look at how the COVID is manifesting in terms of infection of tissues and so on. And what they have seen with BA4 and BA5 is that they are more likely to infect lung tissue in the Syrian hamsters than the BA1 variant was. BA1 variant was interesting in that it really only primarily affected the upper bronchial patterns, bronchial airways. That's where it resided. It didn't get down into the lungs, which is why we were not seeing so much severe illness and pneumonia associated with it. It was more of an upper airway sort of infection. But now with BA4, BA5, at least in the lab, we're starting to get more worried about the fact that they might affect lung tissue. So even Omicron itself, over time, may evolve to the point where it's more likely to infect lung tissue, and then the severity of the illness may increase over time. So I think we've got to be really careful here. Okay, I mean, don't make assumptions about, oh, it's going to stay benign forever, because there's no evidence of that. Right now, the evidence is that Omicron seems to be getting toward things that can infect tissues better than the early Omicron variants could. So we have to watch for that, and that's why I'm waiting right now for the levels of BA4 and BA5 to get high enough in the UK that they will start putting some studies out on it. Right now, they're at about 5% BA4, 5% BA5, and about 5% BA 2.12.1. They're kind of in a horse race right now to see which one can eventually take over the UK. But once they get to higher levels than that, then the UK will actually start to put out some of the hospitalization studies, the vaccine effectiveness studies that have been one of our primary sources of this information throughout this pandemic. But that's probably still a month away before we're going to be able to start seeing those studies. So we don't know right now what the impact of BA4 and BA5 is going to be. And it's important to keep that in mind if you're thinking about going out and getting infected right now. I wouldn't chance them if I were you.
Yeah, that's so scary. I mean, because you just don't know. And I think it was you. Remember when it was you that it was a coin flip? I think it was a was that you that the villagers said, are you saying a 50-50 chance? But we don't know what these variants do, right? Is it the, let's just say it, is the variant's mission to, is their primary mission to increase uh, transmission? Is that their first role as a variant, or as these things are mutating? Is that the goal, to be more transmissible, or to be more severe in illness? Or is it just, we just don't know how the mutations end up, and wherever
Oh,
those wherever those DNA pieces fall is what's going to dictate what the
no, well, fundamentally, I mean, on the competitive scale, what's really important for a respiratory virus is to be more transmissible, right? Because it's competing against all the other respiratory viruses that are out there. And, in case of COVID, each COVID variant is competing against the other COVID variants that are out there. The one that's going to win out will be the one that's more transmissible. Now, with COVID, the illness and death is something that happens pretty far along in the infection cycle. You've probably infected just about everybody else you're going to before you really start to get severely ill. I mean, even with the earliest variants, I don't know if you recall this, the normal sequence of COVID illness was people would normally get something like a cold for the first week or so. And then those who went on to severe illness would start to recover from that. But then they would start to develop the really severe symptoms. So what was happening was the immune system was sort of getting a grip on it, but then the virus won out and basically started infecting lung tissue, and then you went into severe COVID illness. And so that typically was happening like in the second, toward the end of the second week of your infection. And it wasn't happening in the early part. So you pretty much transmitted to everybody you were going to transmit at that point.
Mhm.
So whether or not it killed you didn't really matter to the virus at that point. And so it was literally luck of the draw, right? And
Right.
fortunately, the early viruses, I shouldn't say fortunately, I mean, they killed about 1% of the people they infected. Okay, Omicron has evolved in a way that went the other way. Delta got worse. Okay, Delta killed more people. Delta sent more people to the hospital. But fortunately, it was muted somewhat by the fact that vaccinations were being rolled out at the time, which were incredibly protective. Okay, Omicron moved a little bit more toward being less severe. But now we're seeing in the later Omicron variants, we may be moving back toward somewhat higher levels of severity, but we don't know for sure right now. All we have is lab tests right now. We haven't really observed this in the human laboratory yet. We have to see how this plays out in some other countries when we start to get to higher levels of BA4 and BA5. So, those of us who are on COVID watch, basically that's what we're looking for right now. We want to see what the studies start to show us on BA4 and BA5 in terms of its level of severity and the level of mortality associated with it. But that's probably going to be another, like I say, month, 6 weeks out before we get that information. And meanwhile, it's going to be, probably increasing its spread within the United States. I think I saw some data earlier today that there's a company that actually does a lot of the sequencing and so on. They're saying right now BA4, BA5 is 6 to 7% of the cases in the United States that they're sequencing. They come out with stuff faster than CDC. CDC is kind of slow in getting the data. So, BA4, BA5 are here for sure. And we'll just have to wait and see what their impact is on hospitalizations and deaths. We don't know at this point. And I want to understand this. There are too many people out there who are afraid to say, I don't know. But when you don't know, you really should tell people that. I'm not trying to scare people. I'm just saying we do not know what's going to happen with BA4 and BA5. And if that means you're going to be a little more cautious, I would highly recommend that. You really do not want to get infected with this thing. And even with the current Omicron variants, there's data from the UK now, they definitely can still cause long COVID. Okay, there are a lot of people like, oh, Omicron, it's less severe, so probably less long COVID. No. The studies from the UK, where they do a cross-section sample every week within the population, are basically showing they're still seeing a lot of long COVID coming from Omicron. So just because you had a mild infection with Omicron doesn't mean you're out of the woods. You could still end up with some long COVID symptoms.
Doc, I know we're just about out of time. That was actually the question I was going to ask you as our final question, was because as you were talking about studies, there have been studies now starting to come out. The problem with a pandemic like this is, unfortunately, it takes time to have the data so you can do studies and have them validated. But long COVID, I'm starting to see more and more reports of studies that are being done that are quite frightening, actually, about the percentage of people that are suffering from long COVID, the number of asymptomatic infected people that are suffering from long COVID, the amount of kidney and lung and heart issues that are part of the long COVID list of symptoms. Uh, Again, not much is being said. Not much is, the messaging, again, especially from our state and the national level, is that this isn't as severe, but no one is really talking about the long COVID. And I'm concerned that with these new variants, again, more and more studies are starting to surface that long COVID is real and it's causing some major problems for some of our COVID survivors.
Well, I think, number one, long COVID is real. There's no question of that. Getting an exact definition of it, that's difficult because, in fact, if you look at the papers are all over the map in terms of how they're defining long. There is no question that there is some substantial percentage of people who will suffer either an extended initial illness that may last several months. There's some where it's literally going to go on for years, and we don't know how. We know some people who've had long COVID for at least 2 years. Some of them, will probably keep going beyond that. There is research being done into it right now, but we still don't understand the causes. We still don't understand what possible treatments there are. So in the UK right now, the cross-sectional studies that I talk about estimate that in the population as a whole, not just in people who've had COVID, but the population as a whole, about 3% of people in the UK are currently living with long COVID symptoms that are affecting their lifestyle and their ability to function. There was actually a study that came out not that long ago, I think it was one of the major banks in London, that basically said there's at least 340, 350,000 people who are basically unable to work right now, basically because of COVID-related illness. So there are definitely a lot of people in the UK who are suffering from the impacts of long COVID, and they are not necessarily mild impacts. There are, they can be brain fog, they can be irregular heartbeat, they can be inability, lung problems, inability to walk up a set of stairs without, basically being totally exhausted. So these are severe symptoms in those who do eventually develop it. Now that may end up being a percentage more like, 2 to 5% who get the more severe, longer lasting forms. But a lot of other people in the short term, at least in the first year if they have COVID, are probably going to continue to have other problems and possibly see some other symptoms. And in addition, COVID has a habit as a systemic illness of exacerbating problems that you may have had before. So, for example, one study came out recently that showed that cardiac problems in the year after COVID were about double the rate that they occurred in the population at large. And so some of that was probably related to COVID impacts in making that pre-existing illness even worse going forward. And that's one of the other things we worry about, is that it may leave a lot of people with a predisposition to more severe cardiac disease, kidney disease, or other illnesses going forward that may not manifest for several years. So I'm telling you right now, you do not want to get infected with this virus if you can afford it. Do whatever you can basically to keep from getting infected. Wear your mask, keep your vaccines up to date, avoid crowded places, do your shopping late at night if you can so you avoid the crowds, the unmasked crowds, and do everything you can basically to avoid this, because you really do not want to get this virus.
Thank you, Doc. That's what we've kind of been saying for the last couple months now. Is obviously uh, our leaders not going to change the direction of the state. They are straight ahead, and so our emphasis has really been focusing on what we have to do ourselves. That is wearing the mask, staying away from crowded areas. It's very hard when all the events that are being promoted now. It's quite shocking, actually, but it is what it is. People are feeling a lot safer now. When I think you said it best, you do not want to get this disease, because if you survive, uh, my stepmom had a horrific death with COVID. She didn't make it. But if you survive, you don't know what your long-term effects will be. You just don't know. So why not be safe? And that's kind of the message that we're trying to send. Doc, thank you. Any closing thoughts, real quick, before we sign off?
I think to this large number of people, including that, those people who built up the $156 million record for Top Gun over the weekend, ignorance is bliss. I mean, those people who are going into movie theaters unmasked and taking their chances, all I can say is ignorance is bliss, because they are disregarding a virus that is spreading wildly in the community around them. And those Top Gun premieres probably infected a whole lot of people over the Memorial Day weekend. So be careful, wear your mask, avoid crowds, get your vaccines up to date. If you're immunocompromised, get your Evusheld. Go out, see your doctor right away, and basically get Evusheld. It's a monoclonal antibody that will provide a lot of protection, even against the Omicron variants. So take every precaution you can basically to protect yourself.
Awesome, folks. Again, Dr. Tim Brown, East West Center, one of the top experts here in our state, probably in the country. This guy is the real deal, and I hope you guys appreciate his sharing his information. Always appreciate you, Doc. Thanks again for joining us.
My pleasure.
Village, thank you again. Thank you all. Friday we'll have state representative, Pat Bronco. He's running for Kaikahile's seat in Congress. He will be on to share his insights. That seat represents all the neighbor islands and a segment of Oahu. So if you're in his district and you want to learn from him, hear from him, tune in Friday night at 7 o'clock. We will see you guys there. Everyone, take care, stay safe. God bless. Love you guys. We'll see you soon. Aloha.